"You've always been just a teacher, Mom, nothing more," my son said, not even looking at me as he cut into his steak. And across the table, my daughter-in-law let out a soft laugh like it was the most natural truth in the world, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly around my fork before I forced them to relax, because I had spent 67 years learning how to sit through discomfort without making a scene, how to swallow words that would only make things worse. And so, I simply nodded and kept my eyes on my plate, the same way I had done 100 times before when conversations shifted just enough to remind me that I no longer belonged in them, that I had become something small and convenient in my own family's life, someone to be tolerated rather than respected, and the silence that followed stretched longer than it should have, filled only by the quiet clink of silverware and the low hum of the refrigerator in the background. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a home I had once filled with noise and laughter could feel so carefully controlled now, like every word had to pass through an invisible filter before it was allowed to exist. And I told myself, like I always did, that they didn't mean it the way it sounded, that Daniel was just stressed from work, that Linda didn't realize how her tone came across, that families go through phases, and this was just one of them. But even as I tried to believe that, I noticed the way Linda's eyes flicked toward me, briefly, measuring, almost satisfied, as if confirming something she had already decided about me long ago, and I lowered my gaze again, choosing silence over confrontation, because silence had become my safest place, the one thing no one could twist or dismiss. And yet beneath that silence, something had shifted, something quiet but firm, because earlier that afternoon, while I was standing alone in my small kitchen measuring out coffee grounds for a pot I would drink by myself, my phone had rung, and the voice on the other end had sounded confused, almost amused, as if asking a question that didn't make sense, asking why I hadn't responded to the invitation, why I wasn't preparing, why I seemed completely unaware of something that apparently the rest of the world already knew. And I had stood there, hand frozen midair, trying to understand what she was talking about, trying to match her words with any memory I might have missed. But there had been nothing, no letter, no email, no message, nothing at all, just an empty space where something important should have been. And as I sat there at the dinner table now, listening to my son reduce my entire life to a single dismissive sentence, I realized that maybe that empty space hadn't been an accident. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel small. I felt certain that something had been taken from me, something deliberately kept just out of reach. And I didn't say a word, not yet, because if there was one thing I understood better than anyone at that table, it was this. The truth doesn't need to be forced into the room. Sometimes it just needs the right moment to walk in on its own. I did not sleep much that night, not because of what was said at the table, but because of what I could not stop thinking about. That phone call, that question that did not belong in my quiet, predictable life, and the way the woman on the other end had spoken as if I had missed something obvious, something important, something that should have changed everything. And the more I turned it over in my mind, the less it felt like a misunderstanding, and the more it felt like a gap, a carefully placed absence, like a page torn out of a book before anyone could read it. And the next morning I moved through my routine the way I always did, slowly, deliberately, measuring out coffee, opening the curtains to let in the pale winter light, standing for a moment by the sink as I watched the street outside. The same street I had lived on for over 30 years, where every house held a memory of a time when my life felt full and certain. When Daniel would run through the front door after school and drop his backpack on the floor, talking faster than I could keep up with. When I believed that the small things I did every day mattered, that they built something lasting, something that would stay. But now the house felt different. Not empty exactly, but quieter in a way that made every small sound feel louder, more noticeable, and I found myself checking the mailbox twice that morning, even though I could not have explained why, opening it and closing it again, as if something might appear the second time that had not been there the first, but it remained the same, a few advertisements, a bill, nothing else. Nothing that answered the question that had been sitting in my chest since yesterday, and I told myself again that it was probably nothing, that there had been some mistake, that the call had been meant for someone else. But even as I said it, I remembered the way she had said my name, clearly, without hesitation, and how she had laughed softly, not unkindly, just surprised, as if she could not believe I did not already know. And I felt that same quiet shift inside me again, that sense that something had been happening around me without my knowledge, something that had been allowed to pass me by. While I stayed exactly where they expected me to be, and for the first time, I began to wonder not just what I had missed, but who had made sure I missed it, and that thought stayed with me as I folded my laundry, as I wiped down the kitchen counters, as I sat at the small table by the window with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, because the more I looked at the past few months, the more small moments began to rearrange themselves into something I could not ignore. The missed calls Daniel had brushed off, the times Linda had answered questions for him before he could speak, the way certain conversations stopped when I entered the room, subtle things, easy to overlook, easy to explain away, until they were not, until they formed a pattern that felt too deliberate to be accidental, and I realized then that whatever had been taken from me had not been taken loudly or carelessly. It had been removed quietly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to notice except the absence itself by the afternoon. The silence in my house no longer felt peaceful. It felt deliberate, like it was holding something back from me, and I found myself standing in front of the small desk in my living room where I kept my old laptop, staring at it longer than I needed to before finally sitting down and opening it, because there was only one way to answer the question that had been following me since that call, and my hands moved slower than usual as I typed in my email, the same one I had used for years, the one I checked every morning out of habit even when there was rarely anything new. And when the inbox loaded, everything looked normal at first, the same newsletters I never read, the same store promotions, the same quiet, uneventful stream of messages that matched the life everyone seemed to believe I had. But then I noticed something I had never paid attention to before, a folder off to the side, one I did not remember creating, and I hesitated for a moment before clicking it, not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because something in me already knew that whatever was inside would change the way I understood everything that had happened over the past few months, and when it opened, I felt that same stillness settle over me, the kind that comes when your mind is trying to catch up to something your instincts have already accepted, because there they were, dozens of unread messages, some marked important, some flagged, all addressed to me, all sitting there quietly as if they had been waiting, and I scrolled slowly, my eyes moving over subject lines that did not belong to the life I had been living, invitations, confirmations, formal notices written in a tone of respect I had not heard directed at me in a very long time. And then I saw it, the one message that made everything else fall into place, the official notification, the one that mentioned the award, the ceremony, the broadcast, the recognition that the woman on the phone had assumed I already knew about, and I read it once, then again, taking in every word carefully, noting the dates, the times, the follow-up messages, asking for confirmation. Each one more urgent than the last, each one unanswered, not because I had chosen to ignore them, but because I had never seen them at all, and I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting still in my lap as I let that realization settle fully into place, because this was not a mistake. It was not something that had slipped through the cracks by accident. It had been redirected, hidden, placed somewhere I would not think to look, and the question that followed came quietly, without panic or anger, just a steady clarity. Who had access to my email? Who had reason to move things without telling me? And the answer came just as quietly, not as a shock, but as a confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect, and I closed the laptop gently, not in frustration, not in disbelief, but with a kind of calm that surprised even me, because for the first time, I was not wondering what had happened. I understood exactly what had been done, and more importantly, I understood why. And as I sat there in the fading afternoon light, I realized that whatever they had expected from me, confusion, hurt, confrontation, they were not going to get it, because now that I could finally see the full picture, I no longer felt the need to react. I only needed to decide what I would do next that evening. I sat in the same chair by the window where I had spent so many quiet hours before, but everything felt different now, not louder, not more chaotic, just clearer, like someone had adjusted the focus on a lens I did not realize had been blurred, and I began to think back over the years, not in a dramatic way, not searching for pain, but simply observing, the way I used to observe my students when I was trying to understand what they needed without them having to say it out loud. And I saw it then, not as isolated moments, but as a pattern that had been building slowly, carefully over time, the small interruptions when I tried to speak and someone else finished my sentence for me, the decisions that were made without asking for my opinion, even when they directly affected me, the gentle but persistent way I had been moved to the edges of conversations that used to center around me, and I remembered the first time Linda had asked for access to my email, how she had framed it as something helpful, something practical, saying it would be easier for her to manage certain things for me, to make sure I did not miss anything important, and at the time, it had seemed reasonable, even thoughtful, because I trusted her, because I believed that family did not need to question each other's intentions, and I had given her the password without hesitation, not realizing that what I was handing over was not just convenience, but control. And I thought about the times Daniel had reassured me that everything was being taken care of, that I did not need to worry about details, that I could just relax and enjoy my retirement. And I had accepted that too, because it sounded kind, because it sounded like care. But now, sitting there with the quiet weight of understanding settling in, I could see how each of those moments had led to this one, how each small decision had made it easier for me to be overlooked, easier for information to pass around me instead of through me, and I did not feel anger the way someone might expect. I did not feel the urge to confront them or demand an explanation, because what I felt was something steadier than that, something more certain, a recognition that this had not been done in a single moment of cruelty, but in a series of choices that had slowly redefined my place in their lives. And that realization brought with it a strange kind of calm, because once you understand the pattern, you no longer need to question what is happening. You only need to decide how you will respond to it. And as I sat there watching the last of the daylight fade from the street outside, I understood that whatever I chose to do next could not be rushed. It could not be emotional or reactive, because they had already built their version of who I was, someone passive, someone unaware, someone who would accept what was given without looking too closely. And if I wanted to change that, if I wanted them to see me clearly for the first time in years, then I would have to do it in a way they would never expect, not by arguing, not by explaining, but by letting the truth appear where they could not ignore it, where it would not be filtered or softened or dismissed. And for the first time since that phone call, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, because I finally understood that this was not the moment I had lost something. This was the moment I had found exactly what I needed. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already settled on what needed to happen, and for the first time in a long while, there was no hesitation in my movements, no second-guessing as I moved through my small kitchen, brewed my coffee, and sat down at the table with a quiet sense of purpose that felt unfamiliar but steady. And I opened my laptop again, not to reread what I had already seen, but to respond carefully, deliberately, typing out a message to the contact listed in the official email, confirming my attendance at the ceremony, confirming my availability for the broadcast. Each word chosen with the same care I used to teach my students when I wanted them to understand that language mattered, that clarity mattered. And when I hit send, I did not feel nervous. I felt aligned, as if something that had been waiting for me had finally been acknowledged, and the reply came faster than I expected, warm, professional, filled with details about timing, location, what to expect when the cameras were on, and I read it slowly, absorbing each instruction, noting the address, calculating the drive, about 40 minutes from my house, something I could easily manage, something I would manage on my own, because this was not something I would share, not yet. And as I closed the laptop, the same way I always had, telling him I was fine, that everything was taken care of, that he did not need to worry, and there was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough for me to sense that he was listening for something more, something different. But I gave him nothing to hold on to, nothing that would disrupt the version of me he was comfortable with. And when the call ended, I set the phone down gently, not with frustration, not with sadness, but with a quiet understanding that the distance between us was no longer something I needed to close, because in a few short hours, that distance would be measured differently, not by what I said, but by what they would see. And as the light outside began to fade again, I chose a simple outfit from my closet, something understated but neat, the kind of thing I had worn for years without thinking twice. And I placed it carefully on the chair by my bed, ready for the evening ahead. And as I stood there looking at it, I realized that nothing about this moment needed to be dramatic. It did not need raised voices or explanations or confrontations, because everything that mattered had already been set in motion, and all that was left now was to step into it at the right time and let the truth do what it had been waiting to do all along. That evening, I moved through my home with a kind of quiet precision, not rushing, not hesitating, Just following the sequence I had already decided on, and when I dressed, I chose simplicity over anything else, a soft gray blouse, dark slacks, comfortable shoes, nothing that would draw attention, because I had never needed attention to define what I was worth, and as I stood in front of the mirror, I did not look for approval or reassurance. I only made sure that I looked like myself, steady, composed, unchanged on the surface, even though everything beneath had shifted into something far more certain. And the drive to the studio took just under 40 minutes, the roads. Familiar at first, and then gradually less so, the city lights growing brighter as I moved closer, and I kept the radio off, allowing the quiet to settle around me, giving my thoughts space without letting them spiral, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to figure out, only a path to follow that had already been set in motion. And when I arrived, the building stood taller than I expected, glass reflecting the last of the evening light, and for a brief moment, I sat in the car with my hands resting on the steering wheel, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because I understood that once I stepped inside, everything that had been kept small and hidden would no longer stay that way. And then I opened the door and walked in, the air inside cool and controlled, the reception area bright with movement, people speaking in low, efficient tones, and when I gave my name, the woman behind the desk looked up with immediate recognition, her expression shifting into something warm, something respectful, and she smiled as if she had been expecting me all along, and that small moment, that simple acknowledgement, settled something deep within me, because it confirmed what I had already begun to see, that outside the narrow version of me that existed in my family's world, there was a larger truth that had never disappeared, only been kept out of reach, and I was guided through a series of hallways, past rooms filled with quiet activity, until I reached a space where everything slowed slightly, where I was given time to sit, to review what would happen, to understand when I would be called, and as I listened, I noticed the way they spoke about my work, not in vague terms, not in polite generalities, but with detail, with recognition of specific things I had done, specific lives I had touched, and I realized then that while I had been reduced to something smaller in one part of my life, I had been building something far greater in another, something that did not depend on approval from the people who had chosen not to see it, and when they finally led me toward the stage, the lights just beyond the curtain casting a soft glow into the hallway, I felt no urge to turn back, no hesitation in my steps, because this was not about proving anything, it was about allowing what was already true to be seen, and as I stood there waiting for my name to be called, I did not think about the dinner table, or the words that had been spoken, or the quiet ways I had been set aside, because those things no longer held the same weight they once did, and when the cue came and I stepped forward into the light, I did so with a calm that did not need to be announced, because it spoke for itself in every step I took. The light was warmer than I expected when I stepped onto the stage, not harsh or blinding, but steady, like it had been waiting there all along, and for a moment, I simply stood there, not overwhelmed, not intimidated, just aware of the quiet shift that had taken place, because this was not a different version of me. This was the same woman who had stood in classrooms for decades, who had spoken in front of students who needed guidance, patience, and belief more than anything else, and as I walked forward, I could hear the host speaking, introducing me not with hesitation, not with dismissal, but with a clarity that carried across the room and beyond it, mentioning it was about something that had existed long before their opinions had narrowed it, and when the applause came, it was not overwhelming, it was measured, respectful, and I accepted it the same way I had accepted everything else, with quiet composure, because validation did not need to be loud to be real, and as I stepped back slightly, allowing the moment to settle, I understood something with complete certainty, that nothing that had been said at that dinner table could diminish what had been built over a lifetime, and that truth did not need to be defended. It only needed to be seen, and as the cameras continued to record, capturing every detail, every word, every expression, I knew that somewhere, in a living room not far from where I had sat the night before, a different kind of silence was beginning to take shape, one that could not be explained away or softened, one that would ask questions they were not prepared to answer. And I did not rush, I did not hurry off the stage, because I understood that this moment, once fully seen, would speak far louder than anything I could ever say to them directly when I stepped off the stage. There was no rush of overwhelming emotion, no sudden release, just a quiet continuation of the same steady feeling that had carried me through the entire evening. And as I was guided back through the hallway, people spoke to me with a kind of respect that did not feel exaggerated or forced. It felt natural, as if they were simply beside me when my phone finally lit up, the screen glowing softly in the dim room, Daniel's name appearing again. But this time I did not reach for it right away. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that whatever he was about to say had already been shaped by what he had seen. And when I answered, I did not speak first. I simply listened, and for a moment there was nothing on the other end, just a faint breath, as if he was trying to find a time. It was not empty. It was full of something he could not avoid, and when the call ended, I set the phone down gently, just as I had done before. But the feeling was different now, not because something had been resolved, but because something had finally been seen. And as I sat there in the quiet room, I understood that there would be more conversations, more attempts to explain or repair what had been overlooked. But none of that needed to happen tonight, because tonight had already done what it needed to do. It had revealed the distance that had been created, and more importantly, it had shown exactly who I was without anyone else's version standing in the way. And for the first time in a very long while, I did not feel the need to fill the silence with anything at all.